Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I want to first welcome you to the last International Leadership Series of the academic year 24-25. My name is Yamel Muskis, and I am the Director of the Office of International Experiences. Today, we co-host this International Leadership Series with the Office of Student Leadership and Engagement, and we bring these conversations here to you from campus. This program is actually one of the few programs here in TAMU that receives a medal, and that leads into the International Leadership Fellow Award. This program has been going on for over 10 years, and it brings very interesting conversations. This past fall, we explored how students gain global perspective through their study abroad experiences. We also welcome Dr. Newman and her conversations in conflict and connections between the US and Central America. And we also explored how international student experiences impact campus and what it took them to get here in order to gain their four-year degree. This spring, Dr. Hilburn discussed land, energy, and location. And just last month, Dr. Racine discussed how Mexico in a US literary imagination context. Okay. Every year we have themes in which we focus the series on. This year we focused on globalization and interdependence. And I'm going to be going over some of those key definitions through Oxfam Elements of Global Citizenship today that are going to lead the conversation with our guest speaker today. I want to go ahead and start with globalization. And we define it today as the economic and social political integration of people across the world. So as students here today in a binational university in a border region, you live globalization every day, whether it's through trade, migration, language, or culture. Understanding globalization can be both empowering, explorative, and it is key to becoming a well and ethical global citizen. We also will be discussing interdependence, which is when two or more countries rely on and impact each other. And there are different ways that this can be done. Economic, environmental, social, and political. Living in the United States in the US-Mexico border offers a firsthand view of how decisions are made. You as students can see this in everyday lives. Recognizing interdependence will empower you to advocate for policies and partnerships that value justice over control. Next thing we're going to discuss is social change. And we define it as inclusion of everyone in the full benefits of society and empowerment of people to participate fully in the cultural, economical, political, and social life of the country. What does this mean? So you're not just observers of change, you are change agents. Whether it's advocating for migrant policies, justice, educational access, or just policy changes, your leadership is what can help reshape the systems that are built in inequality. Power is another topic, and we define this as the ability or official authority to decide what is best for others. This ability to decide who will have access to what resources and the capacity to exercise control over others. And understanding power dynamics locally and globally helps us question who gets to lead what, which voices are being silenced, and how you can responsibly wield influence. We will be also discussing privilege, an unearned access to resources only readily available to some people as a result of their advantage social group membership. So we see this reflecting on our own privilege, whether it's citizenship, education, or just access overall. I invite you to use your privilege in the service of others. Lastly, we will be talking about oppression. And we define this as a system that maintains advantage and disadvantage based on social group membership and operates intentionally or unintentionally on individual, institutional, or cultural levels. As global citizens, standing against oppression means listening to those historically silenced and acting on solidarity. So all these themes will be explored by our guest speaker today, Dr. Nicholas Hudson. He joins us being a faculty member from Study Abroad here at TAMIU. He has led multiple programs to South America, focusing on Argentina. And he is also the founder of a nonprofit organization called Amplify South Texas. Dr. Hudson obtained his doctorate education in education, higher education administration, and a master's in professional studies in legislative affairs from George Washington University, and his bachelor's of arts degree in political science from University of Oregon. Today, Dr. Hudson will lead the conversation in a context of interdependence, and he will introduce his topic, Operation Condor, Cold War interdependence, and the lasting impacts of US foreign policy in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. So please help me give a warm, double welcome to Dr. Nicholas Hudson.
All right, thank you. While I switch over here. The presentation for today, and today's topic again is on Operation Condor. And how many of you have heard of Operation Condor before? Some of you may have heard about it from maybe Latin American studies or history course, or from those of you that did study abroad in the program. I am here in my role as a faculty member and kind of helping students understand around some of the globalization and some of the negative effects of globalization and interdependence that existed in the 1970s, 80s, and continues to exist to this day. And so as Yamel mentioned, I am the founder of Amplify South Texas. It's a nonprofit organization, and we look at helping students develop and students and youth develop issues, really to enact their political voice for change in the larger Laredo community. And I don't know what's going on here. So I don't know why my clicker's not working here, but today's conversation is framed in the following. And I really wanted us to think about these topics here. How has the US foreign policy, including this idea of interdependence, impacted the Southern Cone? The Southern Cone being Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, really specifically looking at the Southern Cone area. And I'm going to focus specifically on Argentina. And so the next question that I have, next slide, here is, what are the impacts on the collective Argentine social conscious? When we talk about the collective social conscious, how did it define a nation? How does it define us? And how is the identity of a nation, how has it changed after Operation Condor? The next question that kind of guides us today is, what lessons can be learned here in Laredo, or maybe in the United States, around Operation Condor and what is known as Argentina's dirty war? And we're going to learn a little bit today about the dirty war, or La Guerra Sucia, as it relates to our experience overall, as it plays out today in the United States, right? So I want us to maybe draw some parallels to what is happening on a US political spectrum at this exact moment to maybe what happened 50 years ago in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, and some of the other countries in the Southern Hemisphere. So here's our roadmap. We're going to talk a little bit about this. Then we're going to look at US foreign policy. as a raise of hands, how many of you have focused on US foreign policy before or taken any classes on US foreign policy? Yay, a couple of you, woohoo! Foreign policy is something that is very important to pay attention to on a global scale, and especially as the world continues to shrink with the advent of cell phones and the digital age. We now know what is happening on a global basis, and so we want to make sure that we know what's happening through there. We're also going to learn a lot about Argentina's dirty war, and then finally look at the long-lasting impact that people your age had on an entire country. So why does this matter to me? In 1999, as a 15-year-old young man, I got on a plane to go to Argentina. I lived in Argentina for a year as a 15, 16-year-old person, and I absolutely fell in love with this country, with its people, but also with its culture and the political consciousness of an entire nation as it relates to who they are as an individual. And I encourage those of you who have not studied abroad to potentially look at studying abroad, because it can have a life-altering effect on you and your perspective, right? And so that led to now me leading students abroad. Some of you in this room are here, and they get to learn about this specific experience that happened in Argentina. The course that I teach is leadership and social movements, and looking at how do youth in particular, how have the youth impacted the country of Argentina in their social movements that they have, the various social movements that go on in Argentina. And those that are there, the first day we were there this last time around, we saw a protest happening immediately when we got off right in front of the subte, the subway, as we were walking to the National Cathedral, where Pope Francis was the cardinal of. So you were able to see that at the same time, kind of having that juxtaposition there. So Operation Condor was a formal system to coordinate repression amongst countries of the Southern Cone that operated from the mid-1970s all the way until the early 80s, right? Well before most of you in this room were born, but this was a living program that existed. So the countries that were there in 1975, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay all got together and created this compact. So when we talk about globalization and interdependence, all of those 5 countries were dependent or interdependent on each other for military and political capital with each other. And we're going to learn a little bit more what that means. They were later joined by Brazil in 1976. And then you see kind of the northern part of South America in 78, both Ecuador and Peru joining force. This idea of Operation Condor existed throughout most of South America. All right, so we're gonna watch a video. So I'm gonna try to not just lecture, but also integrate video into this. So you can go ahead and press play.
In July 2021, following years of ongoing prosecutions, an Italian court sentenced 14 men for their role in a program known as Operation Condor, an expansive, US-backed campaign of surveillance, detention, torture, and assassination carried out by right-wing Latin American regimes in the 1970s. This is how it happened. Operation Condor was born in the 1970s. The Cuban Revolution coincided with a number of independence and anti-colonial movements across the global south. In Latin America, this energy was met with a series of right-wing military coups across the continent for over a decade. In 1964 in Brazil, in 1971 in Bolivia, in Chile and Uruguay in 1973, and in Argentina in 1976. The new regimes were ruthless, subjecting their opposition to measures like targeted arrests, imprisonment, torture, kidnappings, rape, and murder. Trade unions, students, artists, and anyone suspected of being left-leaning or with Marxist sympathies were targeted. Because the coups forced many to flee, regimes were interested in tightening the security net between their countries to track dissidents. In 1975, Colonel Manuel Contreras, chief of the Chilean secret police, organized the first inter-American meeting on national intelligence. This was a covert meeting where security delegates from Chile, Bolivia, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay signed up for a new intelligence sharing arrangement designed to track subversives and persons of interest. Brazil joined in 1976, followed by Ecuador and Peru 2 years later. In addition to sharing information, the accords also allowed for agents of one country to operate easily in another. This meant that people could be tracked and captured easily even after fleeing their country, and could be subjected to torture and violence without any sense of protection or asylum. While Operation Condor was not a US program, declassified documents show it undeniably had the backing of the US. The US was equally paranoid about Latin America becoming a base for left-wing uprisings, and the brutality of Operation Condor was a convenient and effective method of containment. The Condor program existed during both the Nixon-Ford and Carter administrations. The Nixon-Ford administration directly financed and armed many of the dictatorships involved. The US also directly trained many officials who went on to create the Condor system at the US Army School of the Americas training camp in Panama, where they were taught counterinsurgency tactics. The US also provided communication support, which was crucial to the operation of the Condor program. There is no question that the US had full knowledge of the scope and brutality of what was taking place. Operation Condor began to collapse in the late 70s after the assassination of Orlando Letelier, a Chilean diplomat close to Salvador Allende. US President Jimmy Carter pressured the Chilean regime to curb its repressive tactics, while Chile and Argentina began fighting over control of the Beagle Channel in 1977. The conflict, which nearly led to war, also began to create fractures between other dictatorships. But the end of the Condor program did not spell an end to political repression and violence in the region. The different regimes' agents and police continued to cooperate to kidnap, murder, and torture people for years to come. The Condor program resulted in an estimated 50,000 killed, 30,000 disappeared, and up to 400,000 arrested and imprisoned. Few of those responsible for ordering and carrying out Condor's campaign of terror and brutality have been brought to justice. Many continued to hold high-ranking government and military positions even after regimes ended, while others went into exile abroad to avoid prosecution. Many victims and their remains are still missing. There has also been no real reckoning for those who were involved in backing and financing regimes from abroad. Over the years, some prosecutions have taken place, but they have been few and far between. Perhaps the highest profile arrest was that of former Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet, who was arrested in London and brought back to Chile. But years of legal wrangling meant that he died still having escaped conviction for any of his crimes. The historic life sentences handed down by an Italian court in 2021 will bring some comfort, but for many, justice for their disappeared friends and loved ones may never come.
All right, so we have this kind of baseline knowledge of Operation Condor, and really it took place in this idea of the Cold War, right? United States and democracy versus the USSR and communism. And there was at this moment in time, really this idea of containment. We're going to contain communism and we're going to keep it outside of the Western Hemisphere, especially after the 1960s and the Cuban Missile Crisis when Cuba became communist. And so there was a lot of paranoia going on in the United States government through our actions. We were still in the kind of dying down throes of the Vietnam War. So we had participated in the Vietnam War to ensure that Vietnam did not fall to communists or to ensure the democratic ideals were in place there. So this is really where it took place. We had an Argentine, Che Guevara, lead the one of the leading forces of the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s. And he really went around South America to kind of espouse leftist ideals of government and support for folks. So you began to see this really take place in that kind of idea of the Cold War. So we're going to look here at the United States foreign policy at this time. So we're going to shift focus. We have a baseline knowledge of the Operation Condor. We're now going to look at US foreign policy. It has been determined that the US was absolutely involved in the following coups that took place, where military took over and overthrew their democratically elected governments. You see here, we have Chile, Brazil, Bolivia, right? Those three countries directly were US involvement of personnel as well as financial support and backing from the United States government, from Secretary of State Henry Kissinger on to other individuals. But you also began to see indirect support of military personnel from the School of Americas, training that they received. And at that time in Panama, all the way up here, we actually had a US invasion of Panama in the 1970s, along, not to the like full military scope, but we also saw here, I mean, that was in the late 1800s, but we still maintained a presence in Panama at that time. So as we still do today. So you'll see here a little bit more, we had the School of Americas located in Panama. And at this time, it was founded in 1946 with the stated objective of promoting stability in Latin America and specifically in Central America. It soon acquired the name, though, of School of the Coups, because many of the military leaders who were in that space later went on to overthrow their governments across the board. They trained 83,000 security forces in Latin America under the terms of the 84 Panama Canal Treaty. You may have heard some conversation in the last 3-4 months around Panama and this Panama Canal Treaty that's taken place on a global scale. The School of Americas was forced out. So the Panamanian government said, we no longer want your presence here, but they still relocated it, and it's located in Fort Benning in Georgia. And to this day, while it may have been shut down in 2001 by an official act of Congress, it still exists today, just a different name. It is now known as the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Operations. Right now, this training still includes military personnel from Latin America and the Caribbean, but it also incorporates ICE and Border Patrol. So a lot of the counterinsurgency techniques that they learn are learned here at Fort Benning, the same locations where South American military leaders learned how to perform torture, kidnappings, political assassinations, and general murder of their people. We're going to learn a little bit more about this in our next video. Oh wait, actually I don't know what happened there, but nonetheless, move on to the next slide. So what was the US foreign policy role here in Bolivia? So we're going to look at different countries. We're going to start off with Bolivia. The US government supported the 1971 coup that took place by Hugo Banzer that toppled the democratically elected president. He had displeased Washington by convening an assembly of the town in which representatives were able to come in and work together. So they were really trying to be more egalitarian and really more equitable inside of their community. And that was not what the US government wanted to hear. And instead, they, the leader, General Hugo Banzer, hatched a military uprising in that time and then ultimately took control, right? So Torres fled Bolivia. He was then kidnapped and assassinated. So the democratically elected leader was kidnapped and assassinated as part of Operation Condor. So you can see Operation Condor in and of itself was targeting democratically elected individuals here. Next slide. Brazil experienced several decades of authoritarian governments, especially after the US-backed military coup against the Social Democrat Goulart. Under then JFK, the US sought to prevent Brazil from becoming, and I quote, another China or Cuba. And so our favorite Texan, many of us, LBJ, actually continued forward with military intervention and support for the overthrow of the democratically elected president of Brazil. And this has been considered as one of the most significant victories of the US during the Cold War, right? And so it allowed for the 5th most populous state in the world to ensure that the rest of South America did not turn into China or Cuba, but became great supporters, pro-Washington, anti-communist group of nations. We are going to look directly at some of the communications from this time between governmental officials here in a second. And so you'll see some of these things that took place. In Chile, another democratically elected president named Salvador Allende was elected in 1970s. And so then that the United States become involved in 1973 in the coup. There's a lot of documents that you can easily Google that the United States federal government knowingly overthrew the Chilean government, and then Pinochet was backed, right? So he was a military dictator for 17 years. In 1988, he was toppled in order to kind of move back to democracy. Free elections were held in 89. Right, but a declassified report from the U.S. government details a plan in 1970 to overthrow this president of another country where he did take office. He did take office. The United States did support the military dictatorship, the military leader at that time, Augusto Pinochet, and said that we wanted to use Chilean institutions as a means of ousting the U.S. president. And I think that's important, right? We have become, as an American country, absolutely involved in the foreign affairs of, or domestic affairs of countries in the Western Hemisphere, and specifically South America, right? And this is him right here when he was arrested in London in the early 2000s. He was living there for a while. He was never, as you heard in the video, never held accountable for the murder of tens of thousands of Chileans. And you can see here's the document in and of itself. The election of Allende as president of Chile poses for us one of the most serious challenges ever faced in this hemisphere. And this was written after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they thought this was one of the most serious challenges faced by the US government ever. The election of a leftist, democratically elected president in South America. It's really interesting to think about. And in Argentina, the United States did not actively try to overthrow the government in specific ways as they had in Brazil, and in Chile, and in Bolivia, but we did have advanced knowledge of their activities and knew that eventually the military would overthrow, right? And so we have U.S. State Department officials described that that they knew about it, and they also acknowledged that the military rule that would happen when they overthrew the Isabel Perón government would last for an extended duration and of unprecedented severity. So they knew that their military would be used against their people, very specifically. So they knew what was going to be happening. The CIA director, another Texan, George H.W. Bush, briefed President Ford on the possible coup 2 weeks before it actually took place. In mid-February 1976, the Assistant Secretary of State flagged the likelihood of human rights violations. Human rights violations include the forcible kidnapping, torture, rape, and murder of individuals in those countries. We expect their military government to be friendly to the United States. We want them to be there. However, in stepping up the fight against the guerrillas, the military would certainly engage in human rights violations, which would then lead to international criticism. This would lead to public and congressional pressures, which would complicate our relations with the new regime. So you can see here, the next page is going to be a Department of State report to Henry Kissinger on what the Southern Cone leaders of Operation Condor dubbed the Third World War. So it's going to be a lot of classified, now declassified information. And yes, I get that it's big on the screen, but I can't see it too far here. So this in and of itself is helping us understand. It's a 14-page classified document that talks about U.S. advanced knowledge of Operation Condor. We should now coordinate intelligent activities closely. The militaries of those countries are doing that. They're being allowed to operate within each other's territories. So Argentina can go into Chile or Brazil and kidnap their people, or the Brazilian and Chilean governments would actually do the work for the Argentinian government, as an example, right? They would go and do that. Have established Operation Condor, defined and to kill terrorists. So that word is very important. See how there may be some connections to political rhetoric that exists currently in the United States. Terrorists of the revolutionary coordinating committees, right, that exist in each one of these countries that are just trying to advocate for their rights as citizens. So you can begin seeing on the right-hand side of the page, the idea of we should not be allowing this rhetoric of the Third World War to kind of become the norm within this. So this is a very long document. We're gonna move on to the next page here, that there is security cooperation. So in Operation Condor, we knew that they were participating, each one of the military coups was participating in that, right? But here, they all said, we're trying to get rid of the subversives. Well, how do you define subversives? And that's what the US government was saying. How do we define military? What is the definition of subversion? How do we say that someone standing out there and saying, I don't, or like overthrow the military, I want my, democratically elected government back? Is that subversive? Or is that supporting, those are the folks that do that, is it supporting something else, right? So you can begin to see here throughout this, they begin to examine this idea of threats that exist that are not imaginary, but we understood what was going to happen as a US government, and can continue to go through here page after page. I have this available to you all, page after page of what is actually happening in those specific countries. How are they interdependent with each other? How does this idea of a shrinking globe and this idea of globalization, how is it playing out in real time in the 70s and 80s as it moves forward? And so we can continue. It's a lot of page together. But I think it's important as you all, as scholars, as students in university, that it is important for you all to begin to utilize primary documents that are available to you throughout your research, and especially in understanding foreign policy. Now, as we move here, we're going to shift a little bit away from what was the US foreign policy, and now look specifically at the country of Argentina, and what did our US foreign policy do? And what, or our lack of intervention on behalf of democratic ideals and the democratically elected government of Argentina, what happened during that time? So on this page, we have here a brick, and these bricks are located all over the city of Buenos Aires, and actually all over Argentina, as a place where people were kidnapped by the Argentine military. And as you can see here, this is an homage to the detained, detained from the state of terrorism from ESMA, which ESMA is one of their military academies in a specific barrio. And so you're going to continue to hear this idea of memoria, justicia, y libertad, y verdad, kind of these concepts all together. And so they began marking all of the places where people were walking on the side of the streets, military personnel, police personnel would come up and put a hood over people and kidnap them, and their families would never know what happened to them before. In this period of time in Argentina, La Guerra Sucia, the dirty war, 30,000 Argentines were kidnapped, presumed murdered, and we're going to talk a little bit about what exists there. We're going to look at some of those things. So we're going to move forward here. La Guerra Sucia, a military junta seized power in 1976, led by Jorge Vidal, and remained in power until 1983. And in those 7 years period of time, the Argentine military murdered close to 30,000 people, disappeared them, los desaparecidos, as you know. But they actually, Argentina played a founding role in the creation of Operation Condor. And La Guerra Sucia was a systematic persecution of political opponents. So imagine you disagree with the government, and then all of a sudden the police pick you up, and then your family never hears from you again. You may be pregnant. You may be a high school student. And we're going to look at examples of this taking place. So the military utilized techniques that they learned from the School of Americas, including clandestine detention centers in the absolute heart of Buenos Aires, one of the most bustling and booming cities in in Argentina and in the world. You can see different locations that are there right across from schools. And in fact, those that were kidnapped that were released said that they knew what time of day it was because of the ringing from the school bells that were coming out there, and they could hear the kiddos walking across. They learned death flights. Argentina is right on the Rio de la Plata, and they have the Atlantic Ocean right there. And so what did they do? They kidnapped people, took them on a plane, because the majority of the clandestine detention centers in Buenos Aires were located near the Jorge Newbery Airport. They would kidnap them, take them directly to an Argentine military plane, shoot them, and throw them out over the Rio de la Plata or into the Atlantic Ocean. And we're going to learn a little bit more about that as well. They conducted surveillance and wiretapping, cross-border cooperation, and again, the kidnapping and torture of folks. And then they began to target exiles, so those folks that lived elsewhere, and political assassinations. One of the most horrific aspects, and all of this is horrific, of interdependence between countries, aspect that took place during this time is, yes, they kidnapped individuals. They didn't murder everybody. So more people were kidnapped in Argentina than the 30,000 disappeared, including folks that were pregnant. And so they gave birth inside of these little detention locations. And when we go on My Study Abroad, we go and visit these detention centers, and they give birth right in those spaces. And those children were then kidnapped themselves and given to military officers. And 50 years later, they still didn't know that they were kidnapped, that who their parents were. They thought it was these folks the entire time. And guess what? And you'll learn a little bit more, but they've learned that they were children of this military kind of regime, and they've been able to reconnect. And so we hear testimonies of one of the granddaughters, or one of the daughters, excuse me, of someone that was kidnapped and was birthed into those centers. When we go on this trip, it's extremely powerful and understanding we have negative actions when we talk about globalization and interdependence. When we rely on each other in military aspects, it can yield wonderful things in terms of cheap goods for us, right? But it can also lead to some really negative outcomes that exist. And this is a perfect example of that. So this is an example. This is the ex-ESMA location. So the ESMA, again, is the Escuela Militar in Buenos Aires. It's where the Argentine, if I'm not mistaken, Navy is trained. And so this is a group of students up here as we're walking through these detention sites. And they're no bigger than I am. I'm 5'2" on a good day, friends. You get to see some of those things in here. This is the entire site. Obviously, I'll talk a little bit more. It is now a memorial site. It's where folks can go and learn about the atrocities that took place in Argentina at that time. Next. So this again is the size of the detention cell that people were completely hooded all day long. And no air conditioning back in the day in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires can get extremely hot in the summer and no heat in the winter. And so some people were there for 30 days, 10 days, 3 months, or in some cases 3 years. We had folks that were in there. And so you can see this is the entire site where folks got to have. It's an entire compound. Military trainings were taking place. And in fact, in I believe it was 78, the World Cup was taking place right here in Buenos Aires. And you got to see some of these locations. This was right down the road from the Stadium River Plate, which is a soccer league there that took place, that housed some of the games in when Buenos Aires hosted the World Cup in 78. This, you begin to see some of the different stories that were taking place. The media was there were still certain freedoms that existed in this time. The media were still able to talk about and document the disappearances. People began to demand answers right away. The military didn't start in 1976, kidnapping. That's when they had the coup. They had already started kidnapping people in the early 70s. During the previous Perón administration as well. So they targeted specifically people your age. And this is why I love taking college students to Argentina to study social movements, because they literally targeted people your age. Because you all have left-leaning ideals and really want to and aspire for change, right? So high school and university students were targets of the military dictatorship, because universities are often thought of and hubs of leftist thought and opposition to the military regime. They did not like the fact that you all were there. They viewed, many students were involved in activism. Maybe some of you in this room may consider yourself an activist. They were also active in political unions, or labor unions and political movements. They were viewed, you all as 18 to 26-year-olds were viewed as threats, right? So universities just like ours, and maybe today, if you look at news, there's some parallels that take place here. Universities are now facing surveillance, raids, and mass arrests. Interesting how history repeats itself over and over again when authoritative figures come into power. So underground activism then became the norm, right? So students didn't care that my friends were being kidnapped. They said, I need to get my friends out, so I'm not going to be deterred from trying to make change. They created secret study groups, secret societies. They utilized street art, graffiti art, and leaflets against the dictatorship. They developed deeper connections to both labor unions and political movements of that day. And then they began to spread the word about what was happening. Those exiled Argentine international students went off to study in England and the Netherlands and in the United States, right? So student organizations then in Europe and in the United States began to pressure their own governments to kind of put a stop to what was happening. You began to see student organizations and universities taking a stand, not only against the military dictatorships of the 70s and 80s, but then extrapolated to another location in South Africa as the United States universities and European universities led the charge against apartheid in South Africa. So this was a global movement in many ways you began to see here. And one of the most famous of nights that took place was La Noche de los Lápices, which took place in 1976. High school students were advocating for free bus ride in La Plata, which is a city in the province of Buenos Aires. So Buenos Aires is a city, but it's also a larger province, like a state, right? And so these were activists demanding free student bus fares. That sounds like something that I've heard people campaign for here at TMU, right? Better bus fares, free bus fare. These were high school students, 16 high school students were kidnapped by the military at that time. The dictatorship accused them of being subversives and linked them to guerrilla organizations. So there was a lot of this guerrilla warfare that took place during this time, although none of them had any connection, beyond just being basic activists. So imagine saying, I want free bus fare and then automatically being kicked picked up by the military. So Pablo Diaz, which was one of the survivors, so not all of them were murdered, but one of the survivors said, we thought they would take us for a few hours, scare us, and then release us. We never imagined the terror that awaited. And in fact, that terror included burning of them. So they tortured them, they burned their genitals as an answer. So Elmise Moller, they thought they were killing us. They thought by killing us, they'd silence us forever. But today, we are the voice of the friends we lost. This event became known as La Noche de los Lápices to symbolize the youth, innocence, and the intellectual resistance, right? Youth are often the intellectual resistance to authoritarian dictators of their time. So you can see here throughout Argentina, this idea of that. So I'm gonna now, hopefully it will play another video. You can hear firsthand.
Seguía siendo buena alumna y más de una vez los profesores me decían, pero Moller, ¿para qué se mete en esas cosas siendo tan buena alumna? Por eso le decía yo, porque soy buena alumna, porque no lo hago para perder las horas, sino porque estoy convencida de que estas cosas se tienen que hacer. Mi nombre es Emilce Moller. En la madrugada del 17 vinieron hombres armados, encapuchados a mi casa. Bueno, y así vinieron a secuestrar y a buscar una estudiante de Bellas Artes, una estudiante secundaria.
Mi nombre es Claudia Julia Chocchini. Tengo una hermana que se llama María Clara Chocchini, desaparecida el 16 de septiembre de 1976 en la denominada Noche de los Lápices.
Se llama al estrado al señor Pablo Alejandro Díaz.
Relátenos sintéticamente las circunstancias de ese hecho que lo perjudicaron.
Las preguntas que me hacían era que le diga un nombre. Me desnudan, me ponen en una especie de catre, me atan, empezaron a quemarme los labios, genitales, me sacan, me dejan un tiempo, se siente un olor como que lo están quemando a uno. Yo no sé cuánto tiempo me tuvieron, uno se olvida el tiempo ahí. Después me sacan, decinos un nombre y te dejamos.
Yo fui a la brigada de investigaciones de Quilmes hasta diciembre, permanecí en ese lugar. Después fui a la brigada, a la comisaría de Valentina Alsina, y en el año 77, con 17 años, entro a Villa Devoto, hasta abril del 78, que me dan la libertad vigilada.
Three separate detention centers. I don't know what I was going to, detention centers. It's so unique. So at the same time as you have high school students, you begin to learn about the abuelas. Well, not the abuelas, you got to see not only high school and college students advocate against the military dictatorships of that time, you began to see mothers of the kidnapped, or now we know them, las abuelas, de la Plaza de Mayo, which is a human rights organization founded in 1977 by Argentine women seeking their grandchildren and the infants stolen during the military dictatorships, right? So they, again, as I mentioned earlier, they kidnapped and murdered thousands of people, and the babies that were born into captivity were taken and raised by military families or the regime sympathizers with their identities erased. And so the grandmothers were the first to publicly challenge the military in a space that existed around La Casa Rosada. There is a Plaza de Mayo, which is the May Plaza to celebrate their independence. Right in front of La Casa Rosada, every single Thursday, the mothers in their little pañuelos would come out and walk in a circle. At that time, the military said you could not have more than 2 people gathered together. If you had more than 2 people together, you would face criminality charges, right? And you couldn't just stand around in your groups. You know what they did? They would walk for hours on end every Thursday around the placita, which is actually a very large plaza. They would walk around. And in 1978, they got national news in the early 80s, and during the World Cup, the Dutch journalists investigated, and we began to see more and more coverage, right? So Argentina's trying to say, look at us, we're so awesome. You know, look at us, we may be a military dictatorship, but we're not that kind of military dictatorship. Instead, we have all these rights, all these wonderful things going on here. And then these mothers wearing their pañuelos, which is the symbolic art form that they have now all throughout Argentina. They said, no, where are our kids? What is going on? They will not give us answers. And so you begin to see them throughout here. Their reports move throughout. So we're gonna move on to, you can see a little bit more about the Dirty War period, not just from me.
Hello and welcome back to World 360. For nearly a decade, one South American country was ruled by a ruthless military regime, the kind that allegedly threw political prisoners out of airplanes. But it seems the men responsible for the atrocities during this period have been finally brought to justice. On Wednesday, a court in Argentina sentenced 19 former military officers, one of whom is a man in his 90s, to long prison sentences for crimes against humanity during the country's dirty war period. So what exactly was Argentina's dirty war period? During the 1970s and early 80s, Argentina, a country whose name is derived from the Latin word for silver, argentum, was ruled by the might of silver bullets and the power of the gun. In 1976, a right-wing military coup overthrew then-President Isabel Perón. It was widely assumed that her term would be short-lived, given the fact that she only assumed the presidency upon the death of her husband and populist president, Juan Perón. But none would have expected that the military regime who replaced her, especially one that would have US backing, would unleash the kind of violence that they did. The right-wing military junta, which was led by dictator Jorge Rafael Videla, who served as the de facto president of Argentina from 1976 to 1981. His government conducted what was known as the Dirty War, during which thousands of people were abducted, detained, and murdered, mainly those assumed to be communists or left-wing. Videla, who died in 2013, was later convicted of the theft of many babies born during the captivity of their mothers at illegal detention centers and passing them on for illegal adoption. In July 2010, at the age of 84, the former dictator had famously said, "I accept the responsibility as the highest military authority during the internal war. My subordinates followed my orders." It was estimated that between 13,000 to 30,000 political dissidents vanished during the coup. In 1995, a former commander of Argentina's Air Force revealed that he had drugged political prisoners and thrown them out of airplanes. Journalist Andrea Yariura Clark, who had fled Argentina amid the political turmoil of the 1970s, once wrote about how the Dirty War was preceded by political violence even when the previous president, Juan Perón, was in power. She explained that Juan Perón became Argentina's president in 1973 after 2 decades in exile, and during his tenure had quietly supported the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, or the AAA. Now, the AAA, formed in 1973, was essentially a state-run death squad that targeted leftist urban guerrillas, labor unions, activists, and left-leaning individuals. So it may be safe to say that Juan Perón sowed some pretty dangerous seeds during his tenure as well. But we cannot talk about Argentina's dirty war without mentioning the US. In recent years, it has been revealed that the US government not only had prior knowledge of the 1976 coup, but also corresponded with the coup plotters. For example, then US Ambassador to Argentina, Robert Hill, reportedly sent a cable ahead of the coup saying Argentine military officer Emilio E. Massera sought an opportunity to speak privately with him. Declassified US State Department documents later showed that during the Dirty War, the military junta used an American communications installation to share intelligence. Let's not forget that this was during the Cold War, when America was trying its best to quell communist sentiments in its backyard, even if it meant providing varying degrees of support to military regimes in the region. Thank you so much for watching. This is Pia Krishnankuti for The Print. Do subscribe to The Printorin and follow us on social media.
Go to the next page. No, it's not going to the next page. So we're going to close out here and learn a little bit more. Maybe it will work now. No, still no. Learn about some of the long-term impacts. So this is some of the street art that you can see here. Las Abuelas depicted as indigenous people there throughout. So we can go to the next slide here. Memoria, Verdad y Justicia. After the military dictatorship, Argentina has really had to grapple for over almost nearly now almost 60 years with the enduring legacy of los desaparecidos and how to hold those accountable in the military and in the political sphere. Las Abuelas continue on their march to find the lost children and grandchildren. They have a center. And so here's some of the information that they still hold. They have some of the documents available. They have quite a bit of information that is done there. And so how they've been able to do this is they hold military accountable through laws passed in the early 2000s to hold senior military officials accountable. Memoria, Verdad y Justicia became now a calling card of this period, right? So they've now had tribunals in the 1980s and in the 2000s. They've created nationwide curriculum, art, and reflection. So that's very important. They have this idea and saying, nunca más, never again, right? Never again, we will never forget, never again will we allow this to happen. We will they? Very recently, we began to see the Malay government, who is the president right now, very right-wing president, say, this never happened. This never happened. All this documentation never took place. We have memory sites, and then now 130 of the grandchildren have now been reunited with their families through what was created in the 1980s. The grandmothers, working with European scientists, created a way to match people through their DNA of the grandparents to children. And so they now created a nationwide registry where people can go, get swabbed, and try to see if you were a child of one of these disappeared individuals. And so next one, you can see here, these are some of the locations. You can learn a lot of information. Next slide, about all of the disappeared people and really understanding who are they? Who are the grandparents or the mothers, now grandparents, las abuelas before they're las madres. What was going on, right? So these are some of the activists that took place here. Next slide. And this is just one of the sites that we go and visit to learn more, continue on, right? And here, go back, you get to see and learn about the death flights, right? So that you heard about it in the film, but you get to see that. I'm going to show you an example here. There's also the torture sites that they have downstairs in the basement of the XSMA facility. Next slide here, they have, just like we do the Vietnam Memorial, they have a Parque de Memoria, where they have all 30,000 names of those that were kidnapped throughout this entire park, along with other things, and we'll see those monuments here continuing on. As you see here in the Rio de la Plata, you see over here, this is a statue, so they commissioned artwork in the mid-2000s, so 2010s approximately, and that is representing one of the kidnapped death flight victims over on the left-hand side, and turning people's houses upside down in there as well, right? So that's what the one over here on the right, the houses turned upside down, represent. Moving on to the next one, individuals kidnapped. And these are just a memorial site, but different art commissioned throughout. Moving on, this is still very much fresh in their mind. You get to see some of the tribunals that took place. They constantly talk about this. This is very much in the national conscious and psyche of the entire nation, saying, never again. This can never happen. A military authoritative dictatorship can never come back in. Can it? And I asked that question, yep. So you can see artwork all across of Justicia, Verdad y Memoria, right? Continuing on. And this is, you can learn a little bit here as we close things out of the Madres and the Plaza de Mayo.
Mi Mirta de Baravalle is one of two remaining founders of the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo. Every Thursday afternoon, she shows up in her white headscarf at the square in front of Argentina's presidential palace. When the clock strikes 3:30, she starts walking in circles, holding up a picture of her daughter, Ana Maria, and her son-in-law, Julio Cesar. It's a ritual Mirta began 40 years ago with a small group of desperate women whose children and grandchildren had been taken by the military dictatorship, never to be seen again. Since then, 12 of the 14 founding mothers of Plaza de Mayo have passed away, but 93-year-old Mirta rarely misses a march.
Y el jueves es algo dedicado a los 30.000.
Thursdays are dedicated to the 30,000 who were detained by the military and disappeared. It's a lifetime commitment.
The mothers have been walking in circles.
I'm like, why won't you let me go? Yeah.
Mirta de Baravalle.
So I wanted to show you, lastly here, this is when we've gone. So this is so that is the end of the presentation. Do we have any questions that y'all may have as we move through this? Yeah. That's the hope, right? That's the hope. I do this every other year. For those of you, please fill out the survey that's up on the screen. But again, that's the hope, because I think it's important that we never forget. But I also think that it's important that we are able, as learned citizens and global citizens, to see some of the parallels that existed in the 1970s and 80s under the military dictatorship to today's what's happening in the United States or in other countries throughout the world, where right-wing politicians come into power under populism, and how they utilize the mechanisms of government to oppress individuals across the board. So there's some parallels to see there. All right, any other questions? All right, thank you all so very much. For those of you who fill out the survey, you'll need to show the survey outside and you can get some food. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hudson.